Thank you all for being here. Welcome. Thank you to History and Theory for entrusting us again at the Remarque Institute with the annual History and Theory lecture of 2025. Ethan Kleinberg, the amazing editor-in-chief of History and Theory, is also professor of history at Wesleyan and a former Remarque fellow. Note is with us. And there you go. And I'm delighted to be able to say a word of praise at once for his relentless work to pursue and make everybody think with the philosophy of history, something that historians are often a little nervous about, and at the same time for his own work on temporal anarchy, part of which was published earlier this year as Temporal Vectors and the Compass of History. And finally, for his leadership of the journal. It's thanks to him and to his colleagues, Valeria, Shazad, and Courtney, that we get to set up the event and host Jacques Rancière. I'm the Remarque Institute's director. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stefanos Geroulanos, and I'm here to briefly introduce Jacques Rancière and discussant Emily Apter for this event. For us, this is a first event of a fairly intense semester. And as some of you may know, we had originally hoped to have this event back in March and had to move it for now. Thank you both to Sam Paul and Amy Nguyen and Lauren Lee for preparing and re-preparing things, and for basically, as this is the first time in the semester, I might as well say it, for being really the beating heart that makes this institution function. Now, to me, it's a singularly weird honor to be introducing Jacques Rancière. Why it's an honor, I think, is already obvious to everybody here. It feels weird to me for reasons that I think are also obvious. Not only does Rancière need, as they say, no introduction, but somebody better than me should be doing it. Somebody who could rather more elegantly distill the 50 books and over 10 books of interviews that he has written, to say nothing of all sorts of other texts, into an account that would be able to speak both of his broader corpus and of his work relating to history. And I'd like to aspire to that elegance, and it's not going to actually happen. So what I should be able to do is quickly and efficiently link his early work, his early involvement in reading Capital, to his 2005 book, Hatred of Democracy, to his leadership of the collective La Révolte Logique, with its historical projects in the second half of the 1970s, to his articulation across many works leading up to the present of a theory of aesthetics that doubles as a politics. And in many ways, this might be an easier introductory task, given the truly interdisciplinary contributions that he has made, from literary theory to aesthetics to political thought. You might as well be giving a major annual lecture to pretty much any of these fields. So we're delighted to be pulling you back toward history, or at least the philosophy of history. I will just say a couple of things to set the stage. Now, in a way that is unmatched by any of his contemporaries, save perhaps the exception of Michel Foucault, history has been essential to Rancière's philosophical analyses, and vice versa. Philosophical problems have fed and guided his historical thinking. This was already the case in his and his colleagues' early pre-68 treatment of history and the cahiers Marxiste-Leniniste as a science concerned with how structuring principles cause societies to function the way that they do. And this went on through to his years at the University of Vincennes and with Révolte Logique, when he worked to complicate our understanding of let's say, of voices from below, so as we usually refer to it. Sorry, I have a little scratch on here. To say, and to continue with voices of the working class and histories of both working class and democratic involvement since the early 19th century. Instead of the ideological blanket under which the worker and related figures were placed, instead of the sense that there simply exists a proletarian who could easily be understood by the philosopher, the historian, the politician, Rancière became a pioneer in foregrounding the untutored discourse of revolt, its considerable differences from Marxist theory, its clashes with it, its insistence that revolt, like proletarian life, was and is ridden with contradictions, dilemmas, and tensions that elite politics and theory simply iron out. This was most stringly the case in his Proletarian Nights about the Revolution of 1830, and then in the essays translated in Staging the People, the Proletarian and His Double, and also The Intellectual and His People. This rethinking of working class political subjectivity was the first angle I wanted to emphasize. The figure that emerged was a history of the worker that, to quote him in Staging the People, quote, stretched from the singularities and even extravagances of the emancipated worker of the 1840s to the constitution of the figure of the communist proletarian and the perversion of the revolutionary syndicalist ideal in the service of wartime collaboration. I have sought, he continues, to pin down some of the tensions between the ethical figure of labor, the sociological figure of the worker, and the political figure of the proletarian that marked in turn the thinking of the emancipated worker, the revolutionary syndicalist, and the communist proletarian. Philosophically, it was and is essential to dwell and think with and within these frictions, where the worker could no longer be reduced to an image convenient for politicians and intellectuals. So his approach to the archive is a second issue that I wanted to just quickly point to, how to make these voices speak and engage, and not simply be spoken over or be included in an easy, democratic, Marxist or other ideological schema. And the third is really the sense that his philosophy of aesthetics and representation, including political representation, relies in a singular manner on this empirical work. And it has enabled so many across fields to think with tension and conflict, to focus empirically on forms of political speech and action that would otherwise be lost to the archive rather than rendered current, and rendered current so that they may be politically urgent. Now, Jacques Rancière, to you, I would just say, if you're an amateur historian per your title, may we all be amateur historians like you. Now I worry that I'm talking to you, which means you can't hear me. Now, for the comment, very graciously, Emily Apter has agreed to give the comment after. This is a tradition in the history and theory lectures. Emily Apter, too, is too important to need an introduction, but I will do a brief one nonetheless. She is a Silver Professor of French Literature, Thought and Culture, and of Comparative Literature here at NYU. She is the author of Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, Feminizing the Fetish, The Translation Zone, Unexceptional Politics, Continental Drift, and other works. I wanted to signal that she is one of the editors of the English version of Barbara Cassin's Dictionary of Untranslatables, and that she runs the translation series at Princeton University Press, which recently celebrated its anniversary. So thank you, Emily, for agreeing to comment. Thank you, of course, to Jacques Rancière for being here with us and for presenting on dividing time, reflections on the practice of an amateur historian. As a matter of protocol, please assume that we'll most likely go until about 2:30. So we're going to have Jacques' presentation first and Emily's response, and then a broader discussion. Okay, thank you very much. Jacques Rancière, the floor is all yours.
Okay, can you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, so first I must thank Ethan Kleinberg and historian theory for the invitation. Second, and first, I must thank Stefanos Geralanos for the introduction and the Remarque Institute for the organization of the event. Well, and of course, I must thank Emily Apter for accepting to come to make a comment, and all the participants to the event. Well, and of course, I must also apologize for the missed appointment in March and the obligation, and the obligation to take this unexpected form. Okay, so you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was afraid. Okay, so when I accepted Ethan Kleinberg's suggestion to go back over my practice as an historian, I was aware of the problem I would face. Namely, I must do two things at once. I must retrace the ways that led me 1/2 century ago to go to the archives and use it the way I did. But I must also situate the result of that process in the theoretical framework that I built later on, but which is a kind of delayed consequence of that intrusion into the domain of the historian. Well, this specific entanglement stems, from a kind of overturn that happened in the very process of my research, when the material that was supposed just to inform me about my object became a real object of my research, and created a new framework of intelligibility for that research. Well, this statement may seem obscure at this point, but my own presentation will be devoted to clarifying it if possible. So I will start with the beginning of the adventure by retracing the context in which my investigation began. Well, this context can be circumscribed between the dates of two events that questioned in different ways the Marxist vision of history as a process through which the development of capitalist production produces the development of workers' consciousness and capacity for action guided by the science of this process. Well, the movement that set ablaze the whole French society in May 68 was a far cry from that model. It happened in a period of economic prosperity and modernist ideology. It was launched by students whose slogans were stigmatized as petit bourgeois and whose barricades apparently, revived the struggles of a bygone century. And it was contained by a communist party acting as the avant-garde of the proletariat. Of course, you could tell that this avant-garde, in fact, they were traitors and opposed authentic Marxism to false Marxism. But the attempts at creating a new political force on the basis of this authentic Marxism prove a little disappointing. So one had to delve deeper into the gap that this entirely event had opened in the logic that made the development of revolutionary action the result of capitalist development and the science of this process. And above all, one must question the notion of history that serves to connect all these terms, science, working class consciousness, and revolution, by identifying the unfolding of time with a necessary linkage of causes and effects. The second event was the strike of the watch factory leap, which happened in 1973. So at a moment when many people thought it was the ebb of the revolutionary tide, the workers of that factory, faced with massive layoffs, had occupied their factory, seized the materials, uh, assembled and sold the watches, and paid their own salaries. By so doing, they had revived an old worker's dream, meaning the transformation of an organization of defense of workers' interests into the sale of a new world where the workers would be their own masters. Now, that said, the event could be interpreted in two different ways. One could see it as evidence of another line of temporality, another form of working class movement that had developed outside of Marxism. But one could rather emphasize the untimeliness of the event that had belied, the idea of the ebb of the tide in the same way as May 68 had belied the image of a country engaged in modernism and reformism. So from these conflicting interpretations stemmed two forms of criticism of the Marxist schema, which were two forms of division of time, one that opposed it another thread between the past and the present, and another one that questions the very model of interpretation based on the idea of a linear historical development. It is in this context and at the crossroads of these conflicting interpretations that I embarked on a research about the history of the working class thought in France, and created with a few friends a research group on the ideologies of revolt. So we wanted to pit against the Marxist view of the development of class consciousness, the reality of historical attitudes and forms of consciousness of the working class, of its inner contradictions and also tensions and contradiction with other forms of revolt. Well, Marx had written his philosophical economical manuscripts in 1844 in Paris. So the idea was, well, we could confront, the analysis of alienated labor in the manuscript with the forms of consciousness and struggle of the French proletarians living next to him in Paris at the same time. But the simple confrontation proved, in fact, a bit tricky for a simple reason. For Marx, that same time did not exist. The proletarians whose texts and actions we could oppose to the analysis were not proletarians. They were old-style artisans, remnants of a former mode of production, and enticed with pre-capitalist fantasies. The true proletarians were not yet there. They must be produced by capitalist development. So we could not only oppose historical reality to a theory of history. We had to question the relationship that this theory set up between time and truth. These relationships locate truth in the global historical process and reject any singular moment into the domain of the not yet, which is a domain of untruth as well. So we had to shame against that logic, identifying the continuity of time with a causal chain, another form of intelligibility based on the division of the present or the untimeless that inhabits the present. And this is what was meant by the syntagm borrowed from Arthur Rimbaud that we chose for our journal, Les Révoltes Logiques, logical revolts. In the Marxist tradition, the revolt is ephemeris and doomed to failure because it ignores what historical development makes possible. But we decided precisely to question this knot between time, science, and the possible. We decided to emphasize the consistency of the revolt as both the construction of an overline of temporality and a specific form of knowledge, a way of reframing the intelligibility of situations. So the evolutionist tradition opposed the long labor of history to the ephemeris character of the moment. But we had perceived in 1968 that a moment is much more than a vanishing point in the historical development. It is a specific dramaturgy consisting in a kind of condensation and acceleration in the perception of situations, interpretation of those situations, and rhythms of action fueled by those interpretations. As such, a moment is a historical force. And we wanted to seize these historical force of some moments of the past and throw those blocks of time amidst the certainties of our present of the 1970s, to undermine both the mainstream analysis of that present and the vision of the historical evolution that underpinned it. Well, this epistemic decision about time was linked to a specific relation to the archive. Usually, the archive provides historians with information out of which they construct an interpretation of the past. But for us, the archive was not a mere source of information. It was an event in itself, whose materiality resisted the dissolution of the moments in the continuity of the historical chain. In that way, the notion of logical revolt shaped against the time of evolution, science, and consciousness, an untimely time, a suspended present, disconnected from a past that would be its cause, and a future that should be its effect. From this point on, the Marxist argument, stating that the same time, which would have allowed our comparisons between two forms of proletariat, did not exist, this argument could be overturned into a critique of that sameness that linked a moment in time with a form of identity. But it was not so easy. It was not so easy to get rid for all that, to get rid of any form of safeness, any form of identity. For a simple reason, I was working on an academic thesis titled The Formation of Working Class Thought in France. Well, the history of formation requires at least two things. First, the continuity of time, and then the identity of a subject. So I had to conciliate these antithetic requirements by constructing for that formation of a form of divided present, which dismissed the evolutionist schema, while allowing me to keep the subject of that thought, working class thought, undivided, in spite of its inner contradictions. With this first stage of the research, was punctuated by a collection of workers' texts from the 1830s, 1840s, that I published with Alain Faure under the title La Parole Ouvrière. We could see workers' words. So this collection gathered very diverse and even contradictory forms of working class expression. Nevertheless, we perceived in that heterogeneous mosaic a common relation to time that overturned the Marxist relationship between capitalist development and working class consciousness. Those workers, I wrote, did not act and write to prepare a future where the proletarians would harvest the heritage of the big capitalist industry formed by dispossessing them from their work and their intelligence. To the contrary, they did so in order to stop the mechanism of that dispossession. So they set themselves in a moment of transition, kind of watershed, out of which two futures could equally come. The future of a capitalist organization that would rationalize the work process so as to create a new form of slavery, or the future of the free and voluntary workers' association that could court-circuit the very development of market economy. So the same time harbored the possibility of two futures. And it was so because the workers had already created a new time, divided time and created a new time during the three revolutionary days of July 1830, when they had taken to the streets to defend the freedom of the press. Well, I must make an important point here about this new time. Many historians have emphasized that several non-synchronic times may overlap in the same time. But what I call the division of time is not an overlapping of times. The new time opened during the 3 days was not simply the interlacing of a political thread with an economic thread. It was a time of collective capacity, dividing the time of collective subjection. So the formation of a workers' thought was both a consequence of that division and a manner of extending it. In that way, my formation questioned the idea of class consciousness. Consciousness usually refers to the awareness of a process, an awareness which is supposed to be produced by this very process. Instead, thought designated for me an autonomous form of activity, the attribute of a form of light. The thought expressed in the text that we had collected was not so much awareness of a situation as it was the exercise of the capacity that that situation precisely precluded. It was the expression of an entry to a new form of life, a kind of, let us say, intellectual republic of workers. So our book, La Parole Ouvrière, staged that first form of division of time and did it in a dual temporal form. On the one hand, it was a collection of materials witnessing in diverse and conflictive form the potency of that new divided time. But on the other hand, the collection was organized in the form of a kind of temporal development, leading that intellectual republic of workers from its first manifestos after July 1830 to to the stolen revolution of 1838 and to its conclusion for them, the opposition of the Republic of Associated Workers to the lie of the Republican government. Well, so there were two forms of structuration of the material which run parallel and at the same benefit. They allowed me to combine the division of time with the unity of the class subject enacting that division. And they allowed me to sidestep the form of the narration, direct narration, that would have required precisely to set up the subject, worker or proletarian in a temporal process of development at the risk of threatening that identity. Well, it is this risk that I faced directly in the writing of my doctoral dissertation, and which forced me to reframe the whole issue of the division of time. And this is the shift which is evinced, by the title of the book resulting from my thesis. It was no more the formation of the working class in France, it was La Nuit des Prolétaires, the night of the proletarians. Well, this shift in names expressed the shift from one form of temporality to another one. Formation still referred to a division division in a continuous and progressive temporality. Instead, night, at first sight, only designates a division of natural time and a division which apparently has nothing to do with any kind of social thought and struggle. And because the night is apparently the moment when the proletarians are precisely far from the sites and occupations which give them an identity. But the course of my research had made me precisely realize that this historical time of the day and the night was the site of the most radical experience of the division of time that defined the proletarian and made a history of workers' thought possible in its principle, if problematic in its achievement. Well, that shift was caused by the access to new archival material. So far, I had looked for the expression of working class thought in writings that affirmed a collective identity, manifesto, leaflets, newspapers, and so on, speaking in its name. Well, the new material put that identity in relation to a call coming from outside. So there were first the archives of the Saint-Simonian group. So they kept the records of the utopian missionaries sent to propagate their doctrine of industry and love among the working class. But they have also kept the, the biographical accounts and professions of faith of the workers they recruited, and also a number of letters of those workers. And this new archive shed light on the universe of intellectual experiences, encounters, exchange, tensions, and contradiction lying beneath the plain affirmation of working class identity. Then there was the archive left by one of these workers, joiner poet Goni, who wrote articles, poems, or philosophical manuscripts from the 1830s to the 1880s. And it is a unique archive in both senses of the word. First, because we have no other archive of this kind, which for normal historians means that because it's not important, it's just an exception. But in my case, meant the contrary. It is an archive of somebody belonging to the mass of those who leave no archive, those who should never leave a trace in history. And it is also unique because precisely this text witness the experience of the frontier, separating those who belong to history from those who don't belong. Well, the fact is that these texts stage in a radical way the relationship between precisely the possibility of a worker's thought and their experience of time. They did so, again, by focusing on the everyday. And the point is that this historical time might be the time when the double nature of time is condensed and revealed. Because time is not only the succession of hours, days, and years, it is also the dividing power that separates two ways of living that succession, two forms of life, and two categories of human beings. There are those who have time, those who can make time the milieu inside which they project their ends and try to achieve them, or enjoy the free time of leisure. And there are those who don't have time, those whose experience of time is entirely contained in the everyday alternance of day and night, work and rest. Goni encapsulated the whole servitude of the workers in a simple formula. They are, he said, the captives of time. So time, this means that time is not only the milieu where capitalist exploitation takes place. It is the power of division that tears the workers' bodies and minds apart. So, on the one hand, Marx's analysis divides the working day into a part in which the workers, in fact, work for their own reproduction, and another part in which they create the surplus value that is stolen by the capitalist. But for Goni, there is no division in that sense, but in another sense, it is the entirety of the workers' time that is stolen. Their entire existence, which is lost in the workshops where they are locked like wild beasts, and where time works as an engine of torture and mutilation that dilacerates their brains and turns them into animals, a daily mutilation after which comes a stultifying numbness of night and sleep. It is this division that defines the proletariat as a form of life that cannot merely be explained by the development of the historical process, but must apparently exist as a kind of perpetual everyday, which is the condition for any form of exploitation. Therefore, the possibility of a worker's thought implies that they break with the times which forbids them to use their brains for thinking. They need to redivide this time, transform the affects attached to the unfolding of the hours, and move the frontier between day and night, so as to shape a body and mind no longer made for servitude. It is this radical redivision of time that Goni's texts both frame and carry out. Well, I insisted more specifically on two of those texts because they precisely deal with the working day. And at first sight, they are just two records opposing the servitude of the working day in the factory under the eyes of the capitalist to the freedom of the piecemeal worker alone in the house where he lays the floor. But in reality, there are no records at all. They are literary operations on time. They turn a succession of hours in which nothing is expected to happen into a narration in which something happens at every hour. And this is how he describes the day. At every hour, there is a different hand gesture, a gaze that strays, causing thought to wander, a thought that arises unexpectedly and changes the rhythm of the body. So a whole play of affects, gestures, and sequences of thought. So this seemingly plain narration was in fact a very precise operation tearing into pieces the continuous and homogeneous time of division. And it turns those pieces into fragments of a reconquest of time. And of course, this redivision of time takes its full relevance with the day of the piecemeal worker, because since no eyes control his hands or the direction of his gaze, the tiny sensory events happening at every hour can become sort of spiritual exercises that make the circle of exploited labor deviate and become a spiral whose curve gradually moves away from the center of servitude. And even the hardness of the task takes on a new meaning as it becomes an exercise of mortification. And those exercises may make him work harder and for the benefit of the master. But Goni assumes that their temporal dynamic defines an over-economy, where the loss in gains is compensated for by a supplement of freedom. Well, I spoke of spiritual exercise. I also spoke of literary operations. Both define the same break with a worker's normal identity, transforming the day at work into a series of exercise of emancipation and putting into a narrative a time that was excluded from that universe. Those two operations are inseparable. Both subvert the normal way in which workers must use their hands, their words, and ultimately their time. For writing, the joiner must take the time he did not have. He must not simply, forget the fatigue of the day and postpone the moment of going to sleep each night. He must more radically cross the line of symbolic separation of conditions that coincides with the least mutable empirical division of time, the one separating night from day and rest from work. And this is probably this breach what is meant by the night of the proletarians. But at this point, the politics of knowledge that makes the archive an event in itself took on its full relevance. The Goni archive was not a source of information that one must link to other sources on the history of working class, nor was it one of those testimonies on the mentalities that historians counterpose to testimonies on facts. It was a fact. It was a fact of the confrontation with the barrier of time, separating those who are counted as historical agents from those who are not. It was a block of present. Work of present out of which the writing of the past and the historicity of its objects had to be resolved. What the archive made appear was a division of time much more radical than the first one I mentioned earlier. The question was no longer about the possibility of a bifurcation in the history of working class food. It was about the possibility of that history itself. The first condition for history of workers' thought is that workers act as thinking beings, that they cross the border, separating those who are destined for handwork from those who are destined for thinking. And the condition for that condition is the redivision of time from which they separate themselves from their historical repetitive working day. That discovery produced in my own approach a split that may perhaps be better understood by analogy with a work of fiction which apparently bears no relation to social history at all. In the central episode of To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf's narration travels between two places. There is a deserted house where all objects are subject to deterioration and where sometimes an old housemaid comes to clean the rooms and looks at her own face in the mirror she is wiping. And there is the beach where unknown walkers at night, that the writer calls the wakeful, the visionary, or the hopeful, steer a puddle or look at a stone to ask themselves, what am I? And see in the mirror of the pools strange figures, promising, quote, some crystal of intensity, remote from the known pleasures and familiar virtues. Something aligned to the process of domestic life, single, hard, bright like a diamond in the sand. Connie's text and the letters he exchanged with his fellow workers aroused the same feeling. They walked like the visionaries on the threshold, separating those who take part in history from those who don't take part. And we look, perhaps like the wakeful, in the strange mirror that they hold up, to perceive a figure of the proletarian, which is as far from the ordinary images of social condition as the images in the puddles are from the image of poor Mrs. McNabb. The history of workers' thought had to be rethought from this crystal of intensity, this experience of a group of workers intruding into the domain of thought where they had nothing to do. But the consequence was that of this was that no direct, no straight line could be drawn from that original symbolic breach to the development of workers' struggles and journals, associations of productions and communist colony. So this is a difficulty I had to face in two stages. In the first one, I must solve the problem of including the division of time and workers' identity in the continuity of a history of workers' thought. In the second stage, I had to address directly that division and to draw all its consequences as regards not only the writing of history, but the very idea of the work of thinking. Well, so the first stage, the problem was how to construct a history of the formation of the working class thought out of the original split between the worker and their identity. And at first, and in a sense, the answer is obvious. The history of that formation is the history of the future of the split. On this basis, I constructed a kind of dialectical plot in three parts. The first part was a sort of portrait of the emancipated proletarian, mostly built around Godey's text. The second one staged the confrontation of those proletarians with the utopian apostles of Saint-Simon. And the third one followed the constitution of the image of the workers' collective under three aspects: the workers' journal, l'atelier, the associations of production created in the wake of the Revolution of 1848, and the communist colony founded by the Icarian workers in the United States. Well, in a way, that construction met the requirements of historical development. It started in the 1830s. It ended in the 1860s with an epilogue in 1890. And that chronological order squared with a movement growing from kind of initial breach, to the kind of solidification of working class identity. But each stage of that solidification was beaten from the inside. It offered a new demonstration of the inner division of that solid workers' identity. In 1848, the editors of the journal L'Atelier stood against the insurgent workers. The communist Icarians were split between the identity of the worker and the identity of the communist. And the associated workers proved unable to realize that they were working for their own sin. Accordingly, my narration was made of archival blocks. Blocks, that followed with one another without being linked in a continuous necessary chain of causes and effects. Instead, the narration moved from one block to another block without being linked, was being linked in a continuous chain of causes and effects. It was a kind of series of shifts for which the contradiction developed new forms and new metamorphoses. Well, that narrative form allowed me to include the experience of the branch into a kind of historical discourse. And it was faithful to the politics of the blocks of time thrown into our present. And in a sense, we could say it was a success, but that success raised new questions. How was it possible to exactly define the method that allowed it and evaluate its legitimacy? And the answer to those two questions obliged me to engage in a new stage in order to give its full relevance to the division of time. The fact is that the method that I had practiced was sound weird to both the historian and the philosopher. Normally, the task of the historian is to build out of the material a specific form of narration which gives an interpretation of what those people have lived. And the task of the philosopher is to analyze the forms of rationality that the historian sets to work. But my own practice had ruined down this three-layered structure and reduced it to a unique level. I had not fulfilled the task of the historian since I had transcribed the texts, the blocks of the text of the workers, without giving an causal interpretation. Nor I had done what is expected from the philosopher, which is to take a distance from which a historical form of rationality can be questioned. To the contrary, I had taken the opposite direction. My philosophical intervention had consisted in withdrawing all the links for which historians used to make sense of events, and had apparently transformed historical discourse into a mere succession of little narratives, a method that my fellow philosophers perceived as shameful empiricism. However, that narrative shift did not forget the conditions of possibility of historical discourse, but staged it in a new way. The archive had taught me that the first problem about the possibility of historical discourse is not about the instruments and methods that it can use to account for its objects. It's about the object itself. The first possibility for history of workers' thought is that workers think. That this thought be not only the expression of their condition, but the product of a specific activity of thinking. And the condition for that condition is the redivision of time, which breaks the normal distribution of occupations and capacity. Well, this lesson of the archive provoked the radical overturn that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. It was now the object of the research that dictated the way in which it should be treated. It was the material that dictated the method. The dramaturgy of the division of time was no longer an object of research. It configured an entirely new space of thought from a new vantage point, the point of the division that configures the space of intelligibility of a practice. That overturn did not only upset the usual way of writing history, but also the position of the thinker in general. As it leads to conceive that position from a specific viewpoint, namely the thought of those who are not supposed to think. That's why the leveling of the three-story edifice and the suppression of the usual links of interpretation was no mere empiricism. It was a way of returning the normal distribution of positions between knowledge, its subjects, and its object, to its first condition, the experience of the division and redivision of time. Well, there might be a reason why my philosophical intervention took on the form of an apparent shift toward mere narration. The fact is that on this issue, philosophy had long made a significant alliance with narration. The role of time in the relationship between thought, its subject and its object, had already been staged in Plato's Republic. But Plato had done it in a very weird manner, as he accounted for it in two ways, none of which fits the good manners of philosophical investigation. First, as a mere matter of facts. Second, as mere fiction. First, he said, the artisans have no time to be elsewhere than in their workshop, because works doesn't wait. Second, they have just the capacity for doing that, because God had put iron in their minds, whereas he put gold in the minds of those fit for thinking and governing. This story, he added, is just a lie that people must believe. So it is this life. It is a lie. It is a pure lie that draws the frontier giving knowledge its first condition of possibility, which is not epistemic, but social and symbolic. The separation between those who are destined for thinking and those who are not. Plato readily agrees that nobody in his generation will believe that lie. But he adds, it will be possible to make the future generations believe it. In other time, it is time that makes the lie of the hierarchy of souls believable. But the point is not that, as time goes by, the artisans will forget that it is a lie. No. The point is that the lie of the philosopher is the reality of the condition of the captives of time. They make the fiction true every morning when they go to their workplace and every night when they go back to sleep. Such is the circular movement throughout, for which time produces and reproduces the separation between those who think and those who are at best objects for thought. Well, this strange knot between lie and truth, between fiction and the reality that validates it, I gave it a name later. I called it the distribution of the sensible, the order which puts everybody, workers or scholars as well, in their place, with the mental and sensory equipment fitting that place. The distribution of the sensible is a power of community to the extent that it is a power of division. And time, as a nexus of reality and fiction, is the first agent of that division. And I think, it is this power of division that is set aside when history is merely defined as the science of men in time. Marc Bloch, who took up this definition from Humboldt, developed it in a formula which is worth examining. I quote, historical time is a concrete and living reality with an irreversible onward rush. It is the very plasma in which events are immersed and the field within which they become intelligible. This sentence makes history an all-inclusive totality. It is not only the milieu where things happen, it is the vital spring that makes them surge and the matter of which they are made. But it is also their field of intelligibility, which means that history is both the name of a collective destiny and the name of the science that accounts for it. We know that this account took on two main forms. The first one is based on the irreversible onward rush. It is the Marxist version that I had initially questioned. The second one relies on the plasma in which events are immersed. It identifies historical necessity with another form of causality, where time is not a principle of succession, but a principle of coexistence. The force that makes all events, all the forms of action, perceptions, and sensibility coagulate and cohere in a global and homogeneous form of common life. And this is the model of the history of mentalities, which at the moment when I completed my dissertation was taking advantage over the Marxist one in the French milieu. But this new form, in fact, kept the main characteristics of the Marxist version. First, the homonymy of history as a reality and history as a science. Second, the vitalist conception of history as a totality. Dividing time thus meant for me questioning the idea of history. I think, well, so my point is that I try to explore this frontier between belonging and non-belonging as a vantage point from which a number of human activities, such as politics, art, or literature, could be rethought. This is how, in Disagreement, I analyze politics as a rupture of a normal distribution of roles and capacity, according to which power is exercised by those who are entitled to do so. Politics starts, I said, with the breach introduced into that normal distribution by the affirmation of a specific part, the part of those who have no. In the same way, in aesthesis, I displace the intelligibility of art toward the frontier that separates art from non-art, while the dominant history of artistic modernity made it the autonomous development of art towards the affirmation of its inner essence. I showed that how the sphere of art constituted itself by a continuous process of rupture of the frontier, separating art from prosaic life, popular entertainment, or technical performance. And in the edges of fiction, I showed that the core of the revolution of modern literature was the destruction of the Aristotelian distinction between two times, the time of the chronicle, which tells how things happen one after the others, and the time of poetic fiction, which tells how they could happen as a consequence of a linkage of causes and effects. Well, it is no time, of course, to expand on those specific inquiries. I just wanted to underline what ties them together and what links them to my travel through the historical archive. In all these cases, there is the same attempt to break with a form of intelligibility that explains a phenomenon by the totality to which it belongs. What this form of rationality usually leaves unquestioned is the belonging itself. It is the fact that this belonging is always played on the frontier between something and nothing. I thought it more fruitful to rethink things from that thin edge where the belonging is ceaselessly on the verge of falling into the non-belonging. This might be the ultimate lesson that I got from my travel in the archives. Far from being the irresistible onward rush or the living plasma, history might be the fragile frontier, with at stake the possibility that any human being be counted as having a share in a common world. Thank you for your patience.
Hey, thank you for hanging in there with me. Quite an incredible, rich presentation. And it's a pleasure to have Jacques Rancière with us, even if only virtual Jacques.
Emily.
Thanks Stephanos and Ethan Lauder for putting this event together and for inviting me to take part. As I read through Rancière's paper a few days ago, I was reminded of how much his work has meant to me over the years. And writing. I wrote an essay on 5 Broadside, The Hatred of Democracy, for a volume edited by Patrick Gray called Understanding Rancière, picking up on the parallel he drew between intellectuals today, and today then meant was the moment when Chirac was president and Sarkozy was finance minister, and the authoritarian elites of Second Empire France bent on waging war against, I think that this was a phrase from Hippolyte Taine, the democratic torrent. Rancière, following Plato, affirms that, quote, the pairing of democracy viewed both as a rigid form of government and as a permissive form of society is the original mode in which the hatred of democracy was rationalized by Plato himself. This condition of democracy hatred is striking, especially in the present moment when the US government is waging full-on war on the so-called permissive society affiliated with minority rights, non-compulsory heterosexuality, reproductive choice, and assembly protest. And of course, this list goes on. So how can Rancière make us unhate democracy? I'm tempted to ask. It's not really a fair question, but I do want to recognize the importance of his understanding of demos as an active agent in the polis, as well as the urgent relevance of his political theory of dissensus laid out in his 1995 book, La Mésentente. The book's English title, Disagreement, offered a mundane, watered-down take on the concept of mésentente, erasing the strong juridical sense of a loss of affectatio societatis, or communal will. And I think we need to take full stock now of the multivalence of this term, including misunderstanding and something potentially really agonistic. First, because it contains the seeds for learning to unhate democracy. And second, and more to the subject of today's paper, because it helps us understand Rancière's praxis as a dissensus-oriented thinker and as a practitioner of doing history and politics together. For Slavoj Žižek, the major forms assumed by politics in the post-war are shaped by the desire to depoliticize mésentente. There is archipolitics, a communitarianism that allows for no void from which a political event can emerge. There is parapolitics associated with the liberal ethics of Habermas and Rawls, reliant on rules that neutralize political agonism. There is metapolitics associated with Marxist or utopian socialisms, which seeks to cancel politics by absorbing it into the order of the collective will. And there is ultrapolitics, very much in evidence today, which turns on an us-them, friend-enemy dynamic, conducive to the militarization of the police and the eradication of any common ground for symbolic conflict. All these forms, according to Žižek, function as foils for deactivated dissensus and the foreclosure of a democracy worthy of the name. A dissensus-driven historiography, desire for the demos, seemed to be part of what is at stake throughout Rancière's oeuvre. Though not a professional historian, he is avowedly, as we've heard, an archivist. The subtitle of Proletarian Nights was Archives du Rêve Ouvrier, a play between Archive of the Worker's Dream and, maybe this is my over-the-top interpretation, Archive of the Dream Work. Rancière's notion of archive is expansive, untethered from disciplinary protocols. In his paper, he speaks of the, quote, archive as the event, an event whose materialities fall outside regimes of history with a capital H, which is to say, imagine beyond logics of causality, necessitarianism, or a telos of revolt. Revolts for Rancière are sites of conflict, unstable frontiers that are themselves nexes of contradiction. The word frontier is used almost interchangeably in this paper with breach, thin edge, and rupture. And the latter, of course, the last, recalls Gaston Bachelard's rupture épistémologique, the epistemological break that Althusser so famously put into circulation to demarcate early and late Marx, and the shift from ideological polemic characteristic of the early works to the scientific materialism of the later work. Rupture also bears some affinity to Foucault's episteme, a unit of unconscious coalescent mentalities that gives way often abruptly to another episteme. But Rancière takes his distance from both Althusser and Foucault, applying rupture to modalities of divided time, or divided, endlessly divisive time. In The Knights of Labor and The Philosopher and His Poor, rupture is identified with a dividing line that breaks with the conventional wisdom of the worker's absence of time and gives back, as we've heard, slack time and existential empty space to those who supposedly had no time to dream and think. Rupture in Aesthesis cites the displacement of the, quote, intelligibility of art toward the frontier that separates it from its inexistence. And rupture in The Edges of Fiction dissolves the Aristotelian distinction between the sequential time of historical chronicle and the poetic time of fictional narration, opening a space that he calls a revolution of modern literature. In each case, rupture involves a break not only with causality, but also with models of history imagined as onrush or living totality. Explanatory models, overarching interpretive paradigms, postures of critique, all these are set aside in Rancière's way of doing history. In their place is a confrontational engagement, categories and procedures endemic to historical analysis. Historicity must grapple with chronos in its broadest descriptions, its ungraspable physics of temporality and punctuality. This has the effect of destabilizing conventional markers or stoppages of periodization, of overturning, a favored term in his lexicon, history as a discipline. But what kind of praxis is this really? How does it build dissensus into its way of working? In place of the paradigm, I'd say, we find a kind of workaround, unsure of itself, willfully disorientated at times from the standpoint of methodology. Now, operating without paradigms or trying to, like swimming without a life jacket or living in the break, tantamount to practicing criticism without an upwand. This looks and sounds like deconstruction. It's no accident. Deconstruction had its part to play in ungrounding criticism's foundational sovereignty and autonomy as pure aesthetic mediation. It focused on language objects as signifying systems rather than as discrete artifacts with distinct histories in print culture. It jettisoned analytic philosophy's black box formalism and language rules in a controlled environment in favor of a restless rhetoricity. Deconstruction followed the path of the disseminated trace into a poetics and politics of what Geoffrey Bennington called scatter. It attacked logocentrism, it Babelized monolingualism. It turned classical ekphrasis into a performance art of plastic reading. It mobilized the aporia or suspended Aufhebung within dialectics. To recall deconstruction's ventures in ungrounding critical foundationalism is not to promote nostalgia for a movement roughly spanning the 70s to the 90s that was tied to Eurocentric traditions of literature and continental philosophy. It is rather to channel deconstruction's agonism, expressed as a preoccupation with difference and divisiveness as critical techne. This channeling was especially evident in Paul de Man's writing. The opening of his essay, Hypogram and Inscription, presented what he called a battlefield strewn with the bodies of enemy combatants. De Man drew parallels among the, quote, disputes among literary theorists in his own time, quarrels amongst theologians in the Middle Ages, and the divisions separating the marketplace and the monastery, the public arena and the academy. The validity of this division, he insists, will soon enough become itself the divisive issue. So what we have here is division begetting division in a kind of runaway sissiparity. What emerges are practices that work against the holding in place of fixed positions, crystallized forms, gestalt images, habitual dispositif, and reified ideas, all of which characterize what one might think of as the ontology of paradigms as essentialized, absolute cognitive entities or functions. Though Rancière is no deconstructionist, I would like to ask him if his dissensus-oriented way of doing history, his insistence on division, his retreat from paradigms, bears any affinities with deconstructive practice. How did he view deconstruction when he was working contemporaneously alongside many of his practitioners, Derrida, Jean-Luc Nancy, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, and others? Their preoccupation with division as différence, as difference, with the Nietzschean untimely, and with the untiming of end of history debates or models popular after Maastricht and the fall of the Berlin Wall, those resonate with his own uses of division and dissensus. I'm just curious to know how Rancière viewed deconstruction. I'm sure others have written about this, but perhaps not enough. In his talk, Rancière brings us back to the event that marked his own lifetime, May 68, associated with untimeliness, logics of revolt, class consciousness aligned with avant-garde practices, the Lick factory strike, the emergence of forms of temporal and historical division diverging from paradigms of linear history. At the time, Rancière tells us he was part of a research seminar titled The Year 1844, the year when the young Marx, exiled in Paris, wrote his economic and philosophic manuscripts. The group's agenda included an examination of the tension between historical reality and the theory of history. What they discovered was not only the profound décalage or gap between historical reality and theory, but also a temporal prematurity, as he mentions, cited in the not yet status of a proletarian subject who was not being seen. Revolt would fail as long as it remained in the pre-given frames of intelligibility. To recognize the new moment, the eventalness of May, time had to be redivided, not according to the working day with its apportionment of free time to certain classes, but according to what he calls the dramaturgy of situations, experienced, I would say, as an expansive sensorium. What does this sensorium, which is inner and outer, individual and collective, immersive and all-encompassing, do to historical practice? That would be another question, which begets another one. It stems from Rancière's citation of Marc Bloch's characterization of history as, quote, the plasma in which events are immersed. Takes from von Humboldt to some extent. And in his paper, Rancière takes his distance from this immersive model, casting it as yet another iteration of history as living totality. But I read this plasma less dismissively as an atmosphere or environment in which informal or unexceptional politics can stir and move, and where Rancière's dramaturgy of situations would seem, in fact, to play out. So my question would be this: isn't there something plasmic and immersive about the Rancièrean infraworld, perceptible and imperceptible phenomena of materialities and immaterialities, of facts as they happen? In his fantastic little book, Le Fil Perdu, The Lost Thread, Rancière fixes on a moment in Flaubert's Madame Bovary, for which he describes with the Aristotelian term, I'll probably mispronounce it, kath hekaston, roughly facts as they happen. Emma Bovary's love is seen to originate in the kath hekaston at the moment when she and Rodolphe meet at the agricultural fair. Like Flaubert, Rancière takes the reader through a thicket of sense impressions and associations, but where Flaubert ultimately allows these particulars to congeal as a critical project, the writerly vocation, the aesthetics of free and direct style, Rancière is concerned to preserve the singular impression as an experience of non-cohering, sensible micro-events. And here's just a passage I can't resist. The heat of a summer afternoon, the voices of the fair which resonate in the air, the braying of the oxen, bleats of the goats, the golden flecks of light around black irises, an odor of vanilla and lemon, the plume of dust trailing in the wake of a passing carriage, the memory of a waltz and old desires stirring the grains of sand in the wind, of which which had for its consequence the action of a hand, hers, slipping into another hand, that of her seducer. It is thus that her love is born as the effect of a multiplicity of sensible micro-events, which swept along in a single wave, swept up words read in books, images from plate illustrations, colorful vignettes embossed on prayer books and keepsakes, the smell of the altar, and refrains from sentimental ballads. This reading of Flaubert is followed by a reference to Virginia Woolf's phrase, "Life is a luminous halo, semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end." I would suggest that with Rancière's readings of Flaubert and Woolf, we encounter a kind of plasmic history that is also a politics of rupture, to the extent that the reader, as well as the ruminating subject of fiction, breaks with daily ritual and stabilized historical chronometry, and experiences time as ahistorical temporality, as blurred chronicities. Rupture in this picture is discernible as lines. He speaks of faintly limned frontiers between being and becoming, between an action and its preparation, between thinking and dreaming. There is no longer early or late, no longer ancestral time versus modernity, despite the fact that Flaubert and Woolf's narrative styles are habitually tagged with the label modernist aesthetics by literary historians. In their place, there is atmosphere, a plasma rife with sensible micro-events. I think this suggests a kind of micro-history that has yet to be fully worked through as a praxis. And here I'll just conclude. Microhistory is clearly already an established métier for the historians. We think of Carlo Ginzburg and the group around the Quaderni Storici of the post-Annales French School, or the work of US-based historians like Natalie Zeman Davis and Robert Darnton. These are not historians who take the full census of sensible microevents in the way that Rancière invites us to do, when he takes us through the archive of Le Rêve Ouvrier, or along the pathways of luminous consciousness in a work of fiction. So for me, it has always been Rancière's ability to tap into the suffusive poesis of little narratives, of archives of everyday experience that give a distinct taste and feel, even a unique historicity to his work. He does not proceed by method or paradigm or critical position. Instead, he evokes with a strange tangibility places and spaces where dissensus politics and the redistribution of the sensible can, might, will happen. Thank you.
No, but I was going to say, Jacques, would you like to address some of the things that Emily said? Would you like to take more questions? Why don't you?
Oh, I think it would. I would need much time, of course, to comment on Emily's comment. Just perhaps two or three things, Perhaps one about the plasma. I understand, the criticism, of what is involved in his comment, and the idea that perhaps there is something to take from this plasma that I have just brushed aside. Well, I think the question of plasticity is a big question, and well, the fact is that this plasma, in historical tradition, is put on in a very kind of globalist and vitalist interpretation. Well, which in fact is linked, to the way the historians of mentalities, precisely used to refer to life, to the vécu, to the plasma, etc., with the which is a kind of thinking of coagulation. For them, the plasma, is not so much, a place of dispersion, and a place of many possibilities. No, the plasma is really, really, you know, the matter, you know, in which you are immersed, meaning also the matter, you know, from which you are made, you know. And this is what I commented when I discussed, you know, Lucien Febvre, you know, about belief, you know, belief, you know, in the tradition of historians, you know, and is really the way in which you know, history really molds people, really made them make them, you know, really immersed in their milieu, immersed, you know, in the plasma, So so my question, my point was not that, well, the idea of the plasma is has to be brushed aside, but there must be a kind of precisely a kind of distinction, you know, and of distinction because the plasma can mean a kind of diversity of possibility, or it must mean that there is one possibility, you know. And what about Flaubert? I think there is the same thing, you know. What interests me in Flaubert is that, of course, that what he makes is creating a kind of sensory milieu, so made of these micro islands that are shared by anybody at all. So for me, it's part of a kind of a democratic revolution of the sensible word itself, you know. But at the same way, it's it is recorded precisely in the idea of the atmosphere that makes it anew again, you know, a kind of necessity, you know. So the point, you know, is whether the plasma or the atmosphere, you know, is a site of multiplicity, a site of possibility, or if it is a site, you know, where you are captive. You know? Well, and this is and because of course, I put the stress today on the division, because it was a topic. It was the topic, you know. I had announced, and division, and well, it was. It was a kind, you know, of travel in the past, you know, and I must, you know, remind you that when I started, you know, my research. Well, I didn't. Deconstruction did not exist, you know, for us, you know. There was the Marxist tradition. There were the different kinds, you know, of structuralism. Well, and there was the attempt, you know, at creating a certain site, you know, of intelligibility, you know, out of those models, you know. And what was interesting for me today, you know, is, I would say, the opposition between the totality and the point of rupture, you know. And of course, it doesn't mean that everything must be, you know, thought in terms of division, you know. But perhaps you can define a form of intelligibility from this point of division, from this point, you know, of the edge between the belonging and the non-belonging. And I certainly, you know, think that it is possible to find a number of connections, you know, between what I have done. What I have done, I would say, unconsciously, because I had no idea, no theoretical presupposition when I started this research. And of course, I think we can find, you know, a number of connections between the result of that research and the theory of deconstruction. But the point is that I did not start from deconstruction. I did not start from the will to deconstruct. I would say that I deconstructed because I was, in a way, forced to deconstruct, because the intelligibility of my object forced me to deconstruct, and I did it in a kind of very, well, I would say, wild or savage way, you know, with no serialization, you know. Well, and perhaps I don't know if I can say I can say more, you know, about this. Of course, the question of the sensorium. Yes, yes. What's important for me, you know, in all my my inquiries is precisely the transformation of a sensorium. What does it mean? The moment when things can cease to be perceptible, to be thinkable from a certain angle, and it is what I tried to analyze in different ways, in literature, in politics, in aesthetics, and well, and of course, there is much to say. So I thank Emily Apter for his very perspicuous and attentive reading. But perhaps we need to discuss to have more time to discuss all her points later on. So thank you, and thank you very much for this comment. It was quite rich and inspiring for me.
Time for a couple of questions. I know that. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you can see me. It's Ethan Kleinberg. I want to return to the, these edges and frontiers and divisions, because one of the things that recurs in the talk that was so forceful is the way you recount your discovery of alternative possible understandings or logics of time that become available, but only if we can dislodge the primacy of what we could call evolutionary or developmental or progressive unidirectional time. So I do think this presumes something, another kind of division, and that might be what we could call a state of timelessness or pre-time out of which these logics of time are constructed. And so I want to know whether you think there's utility in trying to think that sort of division. The division, I mean, you could think of it in terms of Freud's perception consciousness or navel of the dream, to use sort of a metaphor, but really to think about a moment of temporal disunity or pre-temporal understanding out of which logics of time are constructed precisely to denaturalize the progressive or processual time that you find so problematic, but that nevertheless is so pervasive because of the way chronology and narrative and progress seem to all be linked. So could this be a harmonious sort of methodology or theory, trying to get to this moment before, finding another division? That would make these other times, such as the proletarian nights, but other ones, maybe we haven't imagined, available so that we could have, as you suggested, a different sort of notion of a multiplicity of times. That's not a layering, but actually allowing each of these different logics to speak on their own.
Well, the fact is, that I did not, invent. I would say a notion of time. A time as the process from which the ruptures, could come. No, why not? Why? Really, I recall, and here today I'm making a kind of retrospective, far in the past, So when I started, researching, the evolutionist model was still with the overarching, and overarching, and it was and also the notion of identity. The idea that the workers' thought and movement is made possible by through a disidentification of the workers from their identity. It was something, in a way, unthinkable, And so, well, I would say, my first point, was trying to make the unthinkable visible, the present and visible, which means that I did not try perhaps to think of the possibility that this rupture, that these ages, that these ages come from some kind of over time, and of course I must also remember that when I started, Walter Benjamin was almost unknown in France, and so I had not and I had to discuss but later on, precisely perhaps the idea, the Benjamin idea, right, of the dream that is sealed, in the past, and that must be opened at a certain moment, and a very specific moment. Which means, for instance, that there is no unconscious, no historical unconscious, unconscious in my research, and of course I know that the unconscious exists. But I would say that I had no time, to root the forms of division, the forms of bursting out of time, into, well, this is a plasma, of a kind of historical unconscious. And well, it's interesting because, well, of course, Emily also emphasize the word worker's dream, and the fact is that for me, well, the worker's dream is rather the kind of construction, the construction, of an over form of life, another possibility of living, and it is not a dream in the sense, something that that you have perceived, and some kind of fairyland. So for me, the worker's dream is not at all any kind of fairyland, or any kind of dream like the dream. Of course, Marx mentions, in the letter to Ruge, so the idea that men had long dreamt, of something that now they must possess, in truth. In a way, my all my attempt, was to, well, to reduce in a thing, I would say, all levels, all levels. So there is no level, that can be set, that can be set as, the level from which the division comes, from which we can understand these forms of rupture. I don't know if it answers, your questions, but but yes, it is clear. For instance, I always was, at odds with the idea of utopia. Utopia. Everybody around me told me, but yeah, there is utopia. Utopia, is the future that is already there, etc., etc. The future that guides us. I wasn't interested. I said, no, utopia is not the presence of the future in the present. Utopia is an attempt, to incorporate, the words and forms of the appear. So, well, that's what I can answer, and I understand that it is a rather disappointing answer.
I have a follow-up question to what you just said. Like, you quoted this letter by Marx, "The dream of something," that Traum von einer Sache. And I found this always interesting that the thing, the something in the letter by Marx is not defined. So could you say something about this, this temporality of this undefined object or reference in the dream of the workers, in the dream of something, in this immanence of the...
Well, my point, is, well, what I called a worker's dream, was not, an element of that dream, of that something, that humanity has always dreamed of, and of course, I understand, you can interpret it in this way, you know. But again, well, the point is that Marx has no idea. Marx has honestly no idea, because, well, he's still Hegelian, so he thinks that what you know men have dreamt of, it will become evident, you know, at the moment of the break. But well, I'm not interested in the break that will happen, you know, and that will reveal what has been dreamt, you know. I'm rather, you know, interested in this moment. So not the moment, you know, of dream, but in a way, just the opposite, you know. The moment when workers should go to sleep and possibly dream, and decide not to go to bed, not to sleep, and in a way not to dream. You know? And for me, this is for me the real dream. You know, the real dream, meaning the transformation of your ich and nunc. You know, and not the dream of something that will happen at the end of the day.
I'm going to close things at this point. Jacques Rancière, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your invitation, for your passions. You know, you are really kind. You know, because I'm a bit, perhaps I'm a bit confused. You know, when I must explain what I did, but you were very kind.
That's very good. Thank you.